Greetings and salutations, and we welcome you to another episode of Questions, Comments, Answers, and Suggestions Answered from the Bible. And I am your host, Pastor Scotty Bachhaus. Today, we're going to have one of my most controversial questions that we've asked so far. Why is it controversial? Well, I call it controversial because I've had more preachers disagree with me on this than probably any other subject that is brought up. So if that entices your attention, if you don't mind, let's ask this question. Was Vashti wrong by refusing her husband's summons? That's a good, interesting question. Of course, comes from the book of Esther, but it asks the question, was Vashti wrong by refusing her husband's summons? Well, if you don't mind, let's start off by reading the scripture in this historical event. We find it in the book of Esther, chapter number 1. The book of Esther, chapter number 1, starting at verse number 9. Esther 1 and verse 9. Also Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Muraman, Bizath, Horabon, Bigtha, and Agatha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with a crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Now, as we come to this passage here, this is an important idea because we want to find out what is going on. This is one of those passages where we learn very quickly that context is king. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, that we know that the book of Esther is an Eastern book and not a Western book. What do we mean by that? Well, we know that different people around the world have different philosophies, different ways of thinking, and different ways of looking at things. We have to understand that the book of Esther, which happens in what we would call modern-day Iran, has a different viewpoint and philosophy. In addition, we have to understand that this is an ancient book that happens thousands of years ago and doesn't apply to our culture today, meaning that we can't interpret our culture into another person's culture in a historical manner. So we have to understand that there is a different way of thinking, a different way of doing things, and a different way of viewing things. With this, we also have to understand the context of what's going on. During this time, many people who study the book of Esther believe that King Ahasuerus is identified as King Xerxes of the Persian Empire. Now, why is this so important for identification? Well, if this is King Xerxes, then what is happening here is the preparation for the invasion of the Greek Empire, of the Greek city-states. What is going to happen is that King Ahasuerus has made a pledge by his father Darius to put revenge upon the Greek city-states, especially the city of Athens. And so they've done all the preparations they can. They've gathered close to 1 million troops, as some historical people have said. And now, according to their culture, they have prepared a month-long party in preparation for this big war, this campaign that they're going to go upon. During this time that King Ahasuerus has gathered up his generals, he's gathered up his leaders, and in this last segment of the party, he is giving them the last little preparation to show unity, to show a preparedness that they're going together. And during this time, Vashti has grabbed all the ladies, the generals' wives, the king's wives, the rulers' wives, and she is having a separate party for them. Now, at this time is where preachers start to diverge, where they start to get into mind is their favorite preaching. Their preaching is bless God, and that's what preachers say when we can't cuss. Bless God, that if any man brings you out to show you off, you tell him no. Whereas that's good preaching, it does not apply here, because that is not what is being done. There is a key phrase that is found within Esther chapter 1, and it is the idea according to law. And you'll see this idea show up over and over in Esther chapter 1, that the idea and the phrase is according to law. And this is going to set up a context for us to understand. First of all, let me show you this. In the book of Esther, chapter number 1, in verse number 19, what it does is it sets up this idea of the law of the Medes and Persians. Notice with me, if you don't mind, in verse number 19. If it please the king, let therefore go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and of the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti should come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her a royal estate unto another that is better than she. Notice, if you don't mind, what it says here. It says, written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes. According to the laws of the Persian and the Medes, that they saw their God, or their king, as a god. And their God cannot make mistakes. Therefore, any ruling that he makes can never be altered. Otherwise, it would show that their king can make a mistake. In fact, in verse number 19, it says, let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes that it be not altered. Now, once again, we're setting up context. We're showing that the Persians were an empire that was ruled by laws. And so they weren't just going off any whim and could get away with it like Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire, but in fact they are limited by their own laws and rules. Now, why is this important? Because earlier in the book of Esther, chapter number 1, as it's setting up this scenario of where Vashti is going to rebel and refuse her husband's summons, we notice that there's something else going on that really takes the context away from those that are imagining that this is a big drunken party. Notice with me, if you don't mind, in the book of Esther, chapter 1, and notice with me in verse 8. It says, and the drinking was according to law, and none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all of his officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Now, what this is saying is something quite important. Notice again, it says the drinking was according to law. Now, why is this significant? Because the Persians had a rule that it was illegal for someone to be publicly intoxicated in the presence of the king. That means, according to their law, that you could not be sloshy drunk. You could not be intoxicated. You could not be outside of your wit, your mind, your thinking before the emperor, before the king. That would be considered wrong. It would be considered punishable. In fact, notice the next phrase in that sentence, none did compel. That means because of this law, no one was forced to drink. They drank if they chose to, but if they chose to, they could not be publicly drunk. Well, this changes the scenario immediately. We do not have a drunken, out-of-control, wild party. But instead, we do have something where alcohol was available for these people. Remember, this is not an Eastern culture. This is a Western culture. It's recording what the Persians are doing at this time. They are allowing drinking, but they're not allowing drunkenness. So it's not a wild party. In addition, what is the purpose of the party? As we stated before, that they are preparing for the invasion of Greece. And so they are showing unity. They're showing purpose, and they're getting prepared to go invade a foreign land. And so what the king does is that he summons his wife in an idea to show that there's a unity, to show her beauty, to show that we're going to go and we're going to fight and we're going to do it and we're going to protect our people. And so he sends a messenger. He sends one of the chamberlains, and he sends them in one at a time. The Bible lists 7 of them, but it carries the idea that the first one went and said, "Excuse me, Queen Vashti, the king is summoning you. He wants you to appear before him and his generals, and they're going to show a party." And what she did is she said, "No." And so that first chamberlain came, reported, and said, "I'm sorry." The queen said no. Well, the king sent another one, and she said no again. And so 7 times the king has summoned Vashti, and 7 times she has refused to appear. Now, again, it wasn't the idea that they were in a drunken party and they wanted to show her off and leer at her lustfully, but instead it is more of an idea showing unification, showing a togetherness, and that he was going to have her by his side and this last little hurrah before him and his generals went off to war. Now the problem now lies that he has his generals who was supposed to obey the chain of command, and his own wife has refused him in front of all of these generals. This causes a big problem. Who was it that Vashti was disobeying? Well, she disobeys 3 different people. She first of all disobeys her husband, which is her spiritual authority. She not only disobeys her husband, she disobeys her king, which is her civil authority. But remember what I said before, that each of the the Persian emperors were considered as gods. And so she also disobeyed her God, her divine authority. So here she has disobeyed 3 different authorities before one, right before the Persians are preparing to go to war, and a time where the men are expected to obey their authority out in the field. Well, of course, the people were searching, what do we do about this answer? If you notice that even the king searched for the answer according to law. Notice with me in the book of Esther, chapter 1, and notice with me in verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner towards all that knew law and judgment. Notice in verse 15. What shall we do according to Queen Vashti, according to law? Because she has not performed the commandment of the King Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. You see, even the king was trying to obey the law in what to do according to Queen Vashti's rebellion, her refusal to obey the king's summons and the authority she broke, especially in front of the men before they go into battle. This is a big deal. So what do we get from here? What is the idea that we get here? Well, we understand the principle here is that everyone has authority to obey. It doesn't matter where you're at. It doesn't even matter if you're a king. Everyone has authority to obey. We know within the Christian life that everything is a matter of the heart, and that we are asked to obey according to our heart. You see, there's a difference between submission and compliance. Compliance is just doing what you're supposed to do. Submission is doing it with your heart. And God is looking for us to be submitted unto Him and submitted to the authorities He has gave to us. If you ever want to test out if you are truly submitted, here's a test. When someone gives you something to do, are you willing to do it without murmuring, even if that murmuring's kept to yourself in your heart? This is an idea of to find out whether you are submitted. Now again, with the principle, everyone has authority to obey. Everyone has someone to obey. And in this time of chaos and anarchy, this thought needs to be put out even more. Everyone has authority to obey. Well, once again, we thank you for listening to this episode of questions, comments, answers, and suggestions answered from the Bible. If there's anything we can do to be a blessing to you, or if you have a question that you would like answered, please leave it in the comments below or email us if that's what you would like. Thank you.